The musty air of the antique shop was heavy, laden with the smell of forgotten things and time-worn memories. I wasn't planning to stop in, I never did. But the store sign, dangling on rusted chains, seemed to beckon me, the hand-painted letters reading, "Curiosities and Relics." Inside, it was a labyrinth of relics and refuse, the dim lighting barely enough to illuminate the cluttered aisles. My fingers skimmed over cracked porcelain, tarnished silverware, and leather-bound books whose spines cracked like old knuckles when opened. That's when I saw it. Tucked beneath a leaning stack of faded atlases, the notebook seemed almost unremarkable. Its cover was black, scuffed, and as plain as could be. What caught my attention, however, was the faint imprint of words etched into the leather, "For your eyes only." The words were so faint, I might have missed them had the light not caught the cover just right. "Take it," came a raspy voice behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. An elderly man, his eyes clouded and framed by sagging wrinkles, had appeared from nowhere. "Sorry, I didn't mean to." "Take it," he repeated. "No charge. It was waiting for you." His words sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. But free was free, and before I could think better of it, I accepted the notebook with a nod and hurried out of the store. That evening, I sat at my desk, turning the notebook over in my hands. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a paperback novel, and its pages were yellowed, crisp at the edges. I flipped it open. The pages were blank. I sighed, feeling silly for expecting anything different. Setting it aside, I turned my attention to the screen of my laptop. A looming deadline demanded my focus. As a freelance journalist, I couldn't afford distractions, even if they came in the form of mysterious old notebooks. It was late, well past midnight, when I finally leaned back in my chair, bleary-eyed and fatigued. That's when I noticed the notebook again. It was still open, but now there was writing on the page. I froze, a chill creeping down my spine. I was certain it had been blank when I left it. Slowly, I leaned forward, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the paper. The words were written in elegant, looping script. "I knew you would take me." My breath caught. I hadn't written this. I hadn't even touched a pen all evening. "Very funny," I muttered, half convinced it was some elaborate prank. Perhaps the shop owner had rigged it with invisible ink that revealed itself with temperature changes. That had to be it. I flipped to the next page. Blank. Closing the notebook, I placed it back on the desk, determined to ignore it. But as I turned away, I heard a faint scratching sound, like the whisper of a pen against paper. I whipped around. The notebook lay still. Slowly, I opened it again. Another sentence had appeared. "You shouldn't ignore me." Over the next few days, the notebook consumed my thoughts. Each time I opened it, new text would fill the pages, recounting small, mundane details of my day, the coffee I spilled on the carpet, the stray dog I fed outside my apartment. I told myself it was some kind of elaborate psychological trick, a reflection of my own mind projecting itself onto the pages. Still, the uncanny accuracy unsettled me. Then, the entries began to change. One morning, I found a new passage waiting for me. "Beware the man in the gray coat." I frowned, puzzled. The words lingered in the back of my mind all day, a nagging itch I couldn't scratch. Later that afternoon, as I walked to the corner store, I saw him. A man in a gray coat, leaning against a lamppost. His face was obscured by a shadow, but his head turned as I passed, his gaze drilling into me. My heart quickened, and I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder until I was safely back in my apartment. The notebook was waiting for me. "I warned you," it read. The entries grew darker. They described things before they happened, spilled milk that hadn't yet tipped, strangers I hadn't yet met. The lines between coincidence and inevitability blurred, and I became obsessed with deciphering the notebook's intent. One night, as rain lashed against the windows, I found a passage that made my blood run cold. "Do not answer the door." My throat tightened. The apartment was eerily silent, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall. I stared at the words, willing them to vanish. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, tentative. My pulse thundered in my ears as I crept toward the door, notebook clutched tightly in my hand. "Who's there?" I called out. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. I peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Fear coiled in my chest as I backed away. I returned to the notebook, flipping the page in desperation, hoping for answers. The words appeared as if scrawled by an invisible hand. "Do not let them in." I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards or groan of the building, seemed amplified in the dark. The notebook lay on the desk, its leather cover reflecting the faint glow of my desk lamp. When dawn broke, I finally felt brave enough to leave the apartment. I needed to get away, clear my head. Stuffing the notebook into my bag, I stepped out into the overcast morning. The world outside felt muted, as if the city itself had been drained of color. People brushed past me, their faces blurring together. I wandered aimlessly, avoiding eye contact and shying away from anyone wearing gray. Eventually, I found myself back in front of the antique shop. The sign was still there, swinging lightly in the wind, but the windows were dark, the door locked. I pressed my face to the glass, cupping my hands to block out the light, but the interior was empty. Not just closed, cleared out entirely. I rapped on the glass, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" No response. The unease that had been gnawing at me all morning twisted into something sharper. I backed away, nearly stumbling over the curb, and decided to head home. That evening, as I sat at my desk, the notebook began to change. The pages, which had been filling with sentences in neat, looping script, now bore frantic scribbles. The ink bled across the paper in jagged, erratic lines, as if the writer's hand had trembled with desperation. The words spelled out a single message. "Don't look behind you." I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. Slowly, agonizingly, I turned my head. Nothing. The room was empty, the shadows undisturbed. A nervous laugh escaped me, though it sounded more like a strangled gasp. "Get a grip," I muttered, though my voice quavered. But when I turned back to the notebook, the message had changed. "You didn't look closely enough." I didn't know what to do anymore. I couldn't get rid of the notebook. I had tried burning it, shredding it, even throwing it into the river. Each time, it reappeared on my desk, pristine and waiting. And now, the entries were growing bolder. The notebook no longer waited for me to open it. I would wake to find it sprawled open on my nightstand, its pages filled with vivid, unsettling depictions of events yet to come. One morning, the words read, "Today, the man in gray will return." That was all. No details, no warnings, just a chilling certainty. I spent the day in a state of heightened paranoia, avoiding windows and keeping the door locked. By evening, I was a wreck, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. Then came the knock. It was the same as before, soft, deliberate. This time, I didn't approach the door. Instead, I grabbed the notebook and flipped to a blank page, shouting, "What do you want from me?" The ink appeared almost instantly, as though the notebook had been waiting for my question. "To warn you." "Warn me about what?" I demanded, my voice rising. The response came slower this time, each word dragging into the next. "It sees you." My blood ran cold. "What sees me?" The ink pooled on the page, blotching and smearing as though the writer had lost control. When the words finally formed, they sent a chill through my entire body. "Turn around." I didn't. I couldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to stay perfectly still. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing down on me like a weight. I felt it then, a presence, cold and unyielding, lingering just beyond the edge of my vision. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe. "I'm not playing your game," I said through gritted teeth. The notebook's pages began to flip wildly, as though caught in a wind I couldn't feel. The ink bled through the paper, forming a single, harrowing message. It's too late. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, plunging me into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, its weak flashlight casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, just barely illuminated, stood a figure. Its form was shrouded in gray, its face obscured by darkness. And it was watching me. The figure didn't move. It stood motionless, draped in shadow, the edges of its gray form blending into the darkness. My hand tightened around the notebook, its leather binding damp from the sweat on my palms. "What do you want?" I whispered, though my voice barely carried in the suffocating silence. The figure tilted its head, almost curiously, but remained rooted to the spot. The air grew colder, and a faint, metallic tang hung in the room. Suddenly, the notebook grew hot in my hand. I yelped, nearly dropping it, but the words began scrawling across the pages in frantic, spidery script. "Do not speak to it." My stomach churned. I glanced between the notebook and the figure, my pulse hammering against my ribs. It still hadn't moved, but its presence pressed against me like a physical force. I flipped to the next page of the notebook. "Close your eyes. Do not open them until it's gone." I didn't trust it. The idea of shutting my eyes felt like surrender, leaving me vulnerable to whatever it was. My body refused to obey, every instinct screaming to stay alert, to keep watching. The figure tilted its head further, the movement unsettlingly jerky, as though its body resisted its own motions. "Close your eyes," the notebook demanded, the words written so violently that the pen strokes tore through the paper. With a shaky breath, I squeezed my eyes shut. The darkness behind my eyelids was suffocating, more oppressive than the dim light of the room. My other senses sharpened in its absence, every creak of the floorboards, every faint rustle of fabric seemed amplified. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, they echoed through the silence, the sound sharp and out of place against the carpeted floor. My breath hitched as the steps drew closer, each one measured and purposeful. I gripped the notebook tighter, willing myself to stay still. The footsteps stopped. It was right behind me. The cold presence pressed against my back, a sensation like ice creeping down my spine. A faint, raspy breath stirred the hair at the nape of my neck, sending a shiver coursing through my body. And then, nothing. The air shifted, the weight lifted, and I was alone again. Cautiously, I opened my eyes. The room was empty, the oppressive atmosphere dissipated as though it had never been there. I glanced down at the notebook. The pages were blank now, save for a single sentence scrawled in the center. "You survived, for now." The next few days passed in a haze. I barely left the apartment, the paranoia eating away at me. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every sound carried the weight of something unseen. The notebook, of course, was relentless. The entries grew more disturbing, detailing grotesque visions and cryptic warnings. I tried ignoring it, leaving it closed on the desk, but the messages seeped into my thoughts, unbidden and persistent. Then came the latest entry, written in bold, jagged script. "Midnight. It will return. Be ready." When the clock struck 12, I was waiting. I had armed myself with every tool I could think of, a kitchen knife, a flashlight, even a can of pepper spray. My heart pounded as the minutes crawled by, the tension in the room coiling tighter with each passing second. Then, the lights flickered. The air grew colder, and the oppressive presence returned, heavier than before. The figure emerged from the shadows, its gray form taking shape in the corner of the room. But this time, it moved. It didn't lurch or stumble as before, it glided toward me with terrifying grace, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. "Stay back!" I shouted, brandishing the knife. My voice sounded thin, feeble against the weight of the entity. The figure stopped, mere feet away. Its head tilted upright, revealing its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where a face should have been, there was only a swirling void, a bottomless blackness that seemed to suck in the light around it. And then, it spoke. The voice wasn't a voice at all, it was a cacophony of whispers, layered and overlapping, as though 100 mouths spoke in unison. "You were warned," it said. My blood turned to ice. The notebook, which I had forgotten in my panic, flared to life on the desk. Pages flipped wildly, ink spilling across the paper as though the book itself was in distress. I turned to it instinctively, desperate for guidance. "Run," the notebook commanded. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted from the apartment, the knife clattering to the floor in my haste. The hallway was eerily silent, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long, distorted shadows. I didn't look back, I couldn't. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. "Stop running. There is no escape. You were warned." I burst through the building's front door and into the cold night air, my lungs burning as I sprinted down the empty street. The city seemed alien in the darkness, its familiar landmarks warped by the haze of fear. Eventually, I collapsed in an alley, my body trembling from exhaustion. The whispers had faded, replaced by the distant hum of the city. I glanced down at my hands, expecting to find the notebook gone. But there it was, clutched tightly in my grip, its leather cover unscathed. With a deep breath, I opened it one last time. The final words scrawled across the page sent a chill through my soul. "You cannot run forever." And beneath that, in smaller, more elegant script, "You have been warned." The days following my escape blurred into a maddening routine. I slept in abandoned buildings, alleyways, and cheap motels, always keeping the notebook within arm's reach. I didn't want it near me, but every time I tried to leave it behind, tossing it into dumpsters, rivers, or fires, it returned, always in pristine condition, waiting on my pillow or tucked into my bag. The entries, once cryptic and ominous, became sharper, more visceral. They described horrors I hadn't yet faced but knew were coming. "Do not trust the light. It watches from the mirror. You are running in circles." And always, that ever-present refrain. "You have been warned." I spent my days on edge, my nights drenched in sweat. The figure in gray haunted my every step, though I rarely saw it directly. It was always just out of reach, a flicker in my peripheral vision, a shadow where none should be. The notebook offered no solace. If anything, it seemed to revel in my torment. One night, holed up in a dingy motel on the edge of town, I decided to fight back. I sat at the tiny desk, the notebook open before me, and demanded answers. "What are you? Why are you doing this to me?" The ink responded immediately, the words appearing as though carved into the page with a blade. "I am a witness. I record what must be known." "To what end?" I pressed. The pages flipped violently, settling on a single, chilling reply. "To prepare you." "For what?" I shouted, slamming my fists on the desk. The ink seemed to hesitate, the strokes trembling as they formed the next words. "It is coming." The lights in the motel room flickered, and my stomach dropped. I turned, heart pounding, to face the small mirror hanging on the wall. At first, the reflection showed only me, haggard and pale, my eyes ringed with exhaustion. But as I stared, the gray figure emerged, its faceless void swelling behind my reflection like a shadow come to life. The room grew colder, the air thick with a palpable dread. My limbs felt heavy, like lead weights were dragging me down. The notebook snapped shut on its own, and a single word burned into the cover. "Run." I didn't think. I bolted out the door, leaving the mirror, and the figure, behind. The night was eerily silent as I sprinted through the empty streets, the notebook clutched tightly against my chest. As I ran, the whispers began again, louder this time, layering over one another in an incomprehensible cacophony. They filled my head, drowning out my thoughts, until I stumbled to a halt in the middle of an unfamiliar park. The whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. I turned slowly, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. The gray figure stood at the edge of the clearing, motionless, its void-like face fixed on me. "You can't have me!" I screamed, my voice raw with terror and defiance. The figure didn't move. But the notebook began to heat up in my hand, its cover vibrating faintly. When I opened it, the ink was wild, chaotic, spilling across the page. You cannot fight it. Prepare. Part 5. I didn't know what it meant to prepare. Every question I asked only deepened the mystery, every answer the notebook gave felt like a riddle. Days turned into weeks, my body and mind deteriorating under the constant strain. I began to notice patterns in the notebook's messages. Certain phrases repeated more frequently. The mirror is a door. The light betrays. Do not linger in the quiet. They felt like instructions, pieces of a puzzle I didn't know how to solve. One evening, while hiding in the basement of an old warehouse, the notebook's tone shifted. The words were no longer warnings, they were commands. Face it. No, I muttered, shaking my head. I can't. It'll kill me. The pages flipped violently, ink scrawling across every line in furious strokes. You are already dead if you don't. Face it or surrender. Tears blurred my vision as I slammed the notebook shut, throwing it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud and fell open. The ink burned brighter now, glowing faintly in the dim light. There is no escape. The final encounter began that night. The air grew heavy, vibrating with an energy that made my skin crawl. Shadows danced across the walls, taking on grotesque, shifting forms. The whispers returned, but now they spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their cadence like the tolling of a funeral bell. The gray figure stepped out of the darkness, closer than it had ever been before. Its void-like face loomed inches from mine, and for the first time, I felt its true presence, an overwhelming tide of despair and inevitability. The notebook flew across the room, landing in my hands as though drawn to me. Open it, the figure whispered, its voice an amalgamation of screams and sighs. With trembling fingers, I obeyed. The pages were blank, save for one final instruction. Accept. The word on the page, accept, glared up at me, stark and unyielding. My fingers trembled as I held the notebook, its weight feeling far heavier than it should. The gray figure loomed before me, its faceless void somehow drawing me in, pulling at my very being. The air between us was electric, charged with something ancient and terrible. What does that mean? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. What am I supposed to accept? The figure tilted its head again, its movements slow, deliberate, and alien. The notebook began to vibrate in my hands. Ink seeped through its cover, spilling onto my skin, burning like ice as it spread up my arms. I screamed, dropping the book, but the ink didn't stop, it twisted and writhed, carving symbols and shapes I didn't recognize into my flesh. The figure spoke again, its voice a cacophony of whispers and howls. Accept what you are. What I am. I staggered back, shaking my head. I don't understand. The notebook flipped open on its own, its pages glowing faintly in the dim light. The words appeared slowly, as though written with deliberate care. You are the next. The meaning hit me like a physical blow. My breath caught in my throat as the realization sank in. The next what? I demanded, though I already knew the answer. The notebook filled with words, each one scrawled with increasing urgency. The next witness. The next scribe. The next to carry the burden. No. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want any of this. The gray figure stepped closer, and for the first time, its presence felt different. It wasn't just a harbinger of dread. It was offering something. Not escape. Not freedom. But purpose. The ink on my arms began to shift again, the symbols rearranging themselves into something legible. You have seen. You have endured. Now, you must record. My mind reeled. Images flooded my vision, flashes of other people, other lives. Each one was haunted by the same figure, each one driven to the brink of madness by the notebook's relentless warnings. And in the end, each one had accepted. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the memories of countless scribes before me surged through my mind. I saw them hunched over desks, scratching out warnings for those who would come next. I saw their despair, their determination, their resignation. The gray figure loomed above me, patient, waiting. I don't know how long I knelt there. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to stretch and bend, warping under the weight of my decision. When I finally looked up, the notebook was in my hands again, open to the first blank page. The ink had stopped flowing, and the symbols on my arms faded into faint scars. The figure stepped back, its form dissolving into the shadows. Its voice echoed one final time, a haunting whisper that lingered in the air. You have been warned. I am writing this now in the notebook, the same notebook that came to me that day in the antique shop. The pages fill themselves sometimes, guiding my words, showing me glimpses of what's to come. The figure still watches, but it no longer terrifies me. It waits, as it always has, for the next scribe to take my place. If you found this notebook, you already know what comes next. You have been warned.